You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Happy Friday evening, folks. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com to see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can also listen to this broadcast while watching it over on my YouTube channel in the simulcast video. You can also join the other Intrepheads in the live chat room going on right now at my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. You know, with all the talk that's been going on, we've gone from coronavirus and all the talk about that, talk about sequestration, talk about self-isolation, talking about conspiracy theories behind it. We morphed very quickly into talking about race wars, talking about Black Lives Matter, talking about conspiracies behind that, the death of a singular black man by a cop. All of these things have built a narrative, and we keep saying and putting forward the idea that we need to fight the narrative, because there is a narrative that is put at play here to sway people to move to one side of this issue or the other. In all these major things that we have seen happen. We see it even happening with the presidency of Donald Trump. There is a narrative, we say, that is beneath the surface. The narrative that he is a bad person, or the narrative that he is a good person. There are narratives out there that are always in conflict. And I wanted to address that in particular thing tonight. And you know what? I am moved to talk about a couple of different ways of seeing this. And I want you to really pay attention to this, and really, over in the chat room, let's talk about this thing as we're going. I realize the chat room is a place where we gather for social intercourse as well. We talk about our illnesses, we talk about what my daughter did, or what my dad is doing, or how my life is going, and things like that. Those are important things. But I want you to try to focus on this thing that we're going to talk about tonight, about the narrative, and what kind of narrative you have. I'm not talking about being liberal. I'm not talking about being conservative. It's like an article that I wrote that you can, a long time ago, and it's up in my academia site. You can find it when you go over to my website, Scott Allen Roberts, and click on the articles link, where I talked about, the humanity and the different narratives that we take up. Where I said, even in that article at the very end, I said, liberals and conservatives be damned. Because there's a deeper narrative that perhaps we should all latch on to. And so the first thing I want to do is, I'm a writer. I'm working on a book right now that involves a lot of conflict between characters. And so conflict, or a narrative, in the works of narrative, conflict is the challenge. Main characters need to solve and achieve their goals. And so traditionally, conflict is a major literary element of narrative, or dramatic structure, that creates challenges in a story by adding uncertainty as to whether the goal is going to be achieved. And a narrative is not limited to a single or a singular conflict. While conflicts may not always resolve in the narrative, the resolution of a conflict creates closure or fulfillment, which may or may not occur at the story's end. And there's a basic nature to narrative and conflict that is inherent to narrative. When we speak about political narrative, or mythological narrative, or cultural narrative, or what's the one word I'm looking for? Conspiratorial narrative. We talk about all these different things. They're all really the same thing. It's conflict. Conflict in literature, if you take it to a literary point of view, refers to the different drives of the characters or the forces that are involved. Conflict might be internal to the characters or it might be external, something they have to respond to. And that is, it may occur within the character's mind or between the character and the exterior forces or the points of view. And conflict is really most viable between two or more characters, usually a protagonist and an antagonist. I remember in 8th or 9th grade literature learning what a protagonist and an antagonist was. Those were the things that were the basic elements of building a narrative. And but it can occur in many different forms. And a character may as easily find himself or herself in conflict with a natural force, such as an animal or a weather event like a hurricane. The literary purpose of conflict is to create tension in the story, making readers more interested by leaving them uncertain as to which of the characters of force will prevail. And so I want you to look at, and this is how I'm going to take this into my ideas here and other ideas I've gleaned from other very good people about what is narrative in our society. The different kinds of narrative are man against man. Then there's man against nature, man against self, man against society. And by man, I mean humanity in general. So those are the kinds of narrative that exist. And so when looking at this, I think it's really good to apply these things to when we hear people talking about the narrative, fight against the narrative. What's the narrative that's out there? There is a narrative behind the rioting that's taking place, behind the protests that are taking place. And we say, wait, there's more to it than the narrative that's being presented. So how do we combat narrative? And should narrative necessarily be combated against? Because everybody in every situation on all sides of an issue have a narrative that they follow. Stories or narratives are really an important construct that unite and sustain human communities. And these narratives are a fire around which individuals, nations, and people gather. And based on them, we celebrate a common history, a common language, a common culture, and they have the power to inspire a sense of meaning for our lives. They provide hope for the future. And stories, or these narratives that we come across, that's really all it is. When you talk about fighting against the narrative, you're talking about the story of that thing. When you talk about supporting a narrative, you're supporting the story of that thing. And so stories provide ideas which even John F. Kennedy referred to as endurance without death. For as long as narratives form the fabric of human existence, and for as long as war, say, remains a human endeavor, the fight for the strategic narrative during times of conflict becomes imperative. We're in the midst of all kinds of conflict in this country. I would like to think that these are the things we learn from and we grow from, no matter what side of the narrative a given narrative or the narrative that is rising to the top takes. We will get through this, we will survive this, we will learn from this, we will grow from this, we will evolve from this. Sometimes we devolve from that. And you know what happens in human society? Life goes on. Society goes on. Culture, human race goes on. It may come out in different forms at the end or in the outcome, but the narrative that we follow is what dictates our passion toward how we're going to respond to any given thing that's going on out there. Consequently, any discussion of the future of war, the future of conflict, and I'm kind of putting this in a category of war because all of this is a war. Right now there's a culture war going on. We're not fighting necessarily a military war with it, but it applies to military war. So any discussion of the future of conflict has to include consideration of how the battleground for ideas can be won through a persuasive story that can inspire action in people and governments, and thus the way we handle ourselves either peacefully or militantly. John F. Kennedy said, "A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on. Ideas have endurance without death." And this is a truth. Strategic narratives help develop the rationale for the conflicts that we fight and any effort we put into them. Without these conflicts, or this narrative, nothing really rallies or binds people to a common cause. So more importantly, without a strategic narrative, there's no story that provides an alternative voice to those whom we fight. You know, I talked about this on Rocky's show the other day. We used the illustration of Star Trek. And there was a little narrative that that Kirk gave during one of the episodes. And he said this. Now, this is creative narrative. This is literary narrative, if you will, done in a television show. Somebody had to write it. It was good stuff. But listen how Kirk builds his case by using narrative. He said, "They used to say if man could fly, he'd have wings. But he did fly. He discovered he had to. Do you wish that the first Apollo mission hadn't reached the moon? Or that we hadn't gone to Mars and then to the nearest star? That's like saying that you wished you still operated with scalpels and sewed your patients up with catgut like your great-great-great-great-grandfather used to do. I'm in command. I could order this. But I'm not, because Dr. McCoy is right in pointing out the enormous danger potential in any contact with life and intelligence as fantastically advanced as this. But I must point out that the possibilities, the potential for knowledge and advancement is equally great. Risk is our business. That is what this starship is all about. That's why we're aboard her. You may dissent without prejudice. Do I hear a negative vote? This was Kirk in a literary point of narrative. It is the narrative of the fictional story, but he was the character was building a narrative to support his cause. We've done all these great things, and it's all happened because we take risk, he said. And so there's an importance of narrative to human existence. But I want to kind of switch gears with this, because I want to talk about not the narrative of Black Lives Matter, not the narrative of there is no white privilege, not the narrative of there's conspiracy behind the coronavirus, not those narratives. I don't want to look at those narratives per se. I want to look at a different kind of narrative that I think we all should adopt. And I want to start by saying this, is that myth brings light to the shadows, and it reveals what's been repressed. They take a truth about the psyche or society and they form it into a story. We've talked about myths so many times on this program. And the truth of a myth doesn't depend on whether it's objectively verifiable. A myth is the story of a thing, of a society, of a culture. And so I want to look at this, and I want to ask you about the narrative that you are building in your life. And this is the important discussion for tonight. This is what I'm building up to. Are you flailing at the imposition of narrative on the situations that you see in life? Are you fighting narrative you disagree with? Are you putting forward your own narrative that adds to the fray, that adds to the conflict? And sometimes we do this with very good intent. We build our own narrative to fight the narrative we disagree with. Or, without even realizing we're building a narrative, we hail to our own narrative, unwittingly at times, to fight the narrative that we disagree with. So the putting forth of narrative is the way to attract followers, the way to attract support for something, the way to inspire people to believe something. So take the good or the bad, the right or the wrong, the I agree or I disagree out of any given narrative, and ask yourself what kind of narrative you are building. What kind of narrative are we contributing to? When I am very guilty of saying that I disagree with a leftist or a liberal narrative, and I fight against it, but I use a rightist and a conservative narrative to do that. So I get caught up in the trap of fighting, and I think that that's not in itself a bad thing. Sometimes we have to fight narratives. But I want to ask you something. Here's the important question, and the important thing I want us to focus on now through the end of this show tonight. And if I get through this material, it'll be a miracle. I want to ask you, are you building, and I drew this idea from Charles Eisenstein, who was a prolific speaker and writer. He asked if we're building a peace narrative. So let me ask you, in watching the riots, in listening to the protesters, in listening to the race war that's going on, that's ongoing, it's been ongoing, the civil rights movement for 50 years hasn't resolved it. What is it we're missing? Is it because we're fighting narrative against narrative? Is it because we agree with the protesters but disagree with the rioters? Is that the narrative you're following? Is it because we understand that there is a right that is at the core of something, but a wrong that carries through with the narrative on any given side? And so we fight those narratives back and forth. But what are you doing internally? Remember when we've talked about being in the now, being awake, being aware that you're awake, a very different thing from being woke, which is a cultural narrative that has watered down what being awake and being in the now really means. So pulling off of that information that we've talked about before, that way of living, what is your peace narrative? Is this what you push for? And so the word narrative has been thrown around a whole lot these days. It's almost like it's become a cliche. But cliches, remember, are born from insight. In their initial form, a thing that has become cliche was something that was an original idea, born out of insight over something. And so in this case, all the cliches about narrative is about the power of the stories that we tell about ourselves, about each other, about the world that's around us. And they're all there to use to cohere us to a common purpose. That is the point of a narrative. The purpose of narrative is to coalesce us into common purpose about something. And so a lot of things that we need to do today don't make sense if you're the only one doing them. A story can order the world so that we see our choices as part of a larger happening. A story can order the world, and it puts order to our lives. It makes things make sense for us. And so, granted, the larger happening that's unfolding on the planet today is bigger than any story that we could make about it. Nonetheless, a story that allows me to make meaning of my life, identify my allies, and understand what my role is an essential thing. So narratives are essential. They're essential for making sense of things. If somebody just says, we're going to go... Now, I'm not speaking on the right or wrong of this. I'm speaking on the mechanics of it. If somebody said to you, we're going to go smash a bunch of business windows and set them on fire to make our point. That's... You could step back from that and go, that's not right. You can't do that. But the narrative builds... It's because of this, and this that we are smashing windows and burning buildings. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not justifying those actions. I'm saying a narrative needed to be built behind that to justify it. And this is why people will follow it. And this is why I think you see a lot of false narrative going on out there. But narrative is essential to making my role in it essential. A narrative sometimes has to be built to justify why I can allow something despicable to happen in order to create what I believe is the greater good that should come from it. And the converse is just as valid. I sometimes need a narrative to be able to fight that narrative. So, narrative brings meaning to my life. It brings identity. It helps me identify who my allies are. And it helps me to understand what my role is. And so the understanding of the power of narrative extends to all parts of the political spectrum. Everyone wants to control the narrative. It's a power for good or ill. Hitler understood that. He wrote a narrative of racial superiority and national glory that legitimizes ambitions, and it channeled his latent cultural energies toward genocide and conquest. Now, we would never say that was good, but he used narrative to accomplish that. Today, we have a powerful, unresolved energies that are going on in our own society. Just like in the 1930s, discontent, desperation, hostility to the elites, anger at the way society is turned, grief over the loss of community. These are the things that express... How these express depends in a large part on how problem and solution, cause and effect are narrated to us. So if we want to serve peace and well-being, which is something we all want, don't we all want peace and happiness and well-being out there? I mean, even now, the big narrative in self-help is self-healing, well-being. Go lay in the grass to ground yourself. And I agree with these things, but that is a narrative that's being pushed forward to help us find our well-being. And so if we want peace, if we want to serve peace, if we want to serve well-being for everyone in the world, a world of healing where society and all the beings on this planet are moved toward greater wholeness, we'd better make sure that we're telling the right story. Look at what's going on in society today and ask yourself, what is the right story? What's being told? So today, the dominant narrative, whether we recognize it or not, is a war narrative. That is what is dominant today in our society. Not only on the obvious level of U.S. foreign policy, which identifies our enemies around the world. Oh, the Russians are bad. Oh, the Chinese are bad, and all of this. That's a necessary thing. We have to do that to defend our country. We have to identify our enemies around the world. We got to bomb them. But also in our basic understanding of how the world works and how to solve problems in the world. War thinking permeates our public psyche right now. Look out there at the news, look at the world around you, and tell me war narrative is not the primary narrative that's happening. So you have to begin by excavating it, laying the foundation of a peace narrative instead of a war narrative. So there's a myth behind redemptive violence. which is what people are calling the rioting, redemptive violence. We're going to look at that when we come back, because we got to go out to break already, believe it or not. So sit tight. We'll be right back. All right, gang, thanks for sitting on through that break. Welcome back to the show. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you're also watching the simulcast video over on my YouTube channel and hopefully joining in the chat room. And I know a lot more people come and watch the YouTube than actually join into the chat room, but you're welcome to come in and add your 2 cents worth over at youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Now, I want to get right back into this because I have so much material here. And we're asking, what is your narrative? We may be following narratives out there as we laid the foundation for in the first segment, if you missed that. But what foundational narrative do you follow? And should we all then be pursuing a narrative of peace? Because right now, folks, believe it or not, we're living in a war narrative. Whether it's a military campaign or whether it's a war of words or a war of races, we got stuff going. And by the way, to really start setting a peace narrative for yourself, first thing you got to realize is that there are no races. We're all one race. We have different colors, we have different subsegments of our race, but we're all human beings. And as Carl Sagan said in his Blue Dot, a little video, go look that up, The Blue Dot by Carl Sagan. We all live here. Every human being that has ever lived, good, bad, murderous, peaceful, powerful, weak, they've all lived and died on this planet. We are all part of this planet. This is who we are. We're the human race. Now, I'm not going to be a peacer, a shalala, kumbaya here. This is not the narrative I'm looking for or trying to get across. So don't make that mistake as we start to dig into this. But do you possess a peace narrative? So we ended with talking about just introducing the idea of the myth of redemptive violence. There was a classic essay by Christian theologian Walter Wink called The Myth of Redemptive Violence. Redemptive violence is the idea that the way to make a better world is to destroy something, to kill something, to kill evil, to extirpate evil, to overcome forces of evil and chaos by the forces of good and order. Good versus evil. Good will triumph. Kill the evil. Now, Wink traced it back to a Babylonian creation myth over 3,000 years old. In the beginning, the god Adsu and the goddess Tiamat were all by themselves in the universe. And since that was boring, they decided to have kids, a whole bunch of them. And it wasn't long before they regretted it because the kids were making too much noise. I just think of Rainey and I. Maybe you can think of your own circumstances. I love you. Let's have kids. Boom. 10 years later, you're going, oh my God, what were we thinking? I love my children, but my children disrupt my peace. I got to tell you that. As much as I love them and would never have it any different, my children disrupt my calm. And so anyway, the gods, they decided, of course, that they were going to kill all their children off, right? Problem solved. Well, the children got wind of this plan, and they decided that they were going to kill their parents first. And it wasn't too hard to finish off Adsu, the old male god, poof, gone. But Tiamat was different. None of them dared to face Tiamat until the youngest of the children, Marduk, volunteered. And he said, I'll destroy Tiamat, our mother, on condition that all you brothers and sisters make me the supreme ruler of the universe. I'll leave it to your imagination to draw the parallels to the U.S. after World War II or any other parallel you want to draw. Marduk comes up with a plan. He blows poison gas into the stomach of Tiamat, stabs her with a spear. She explodes. All her guts and blood spew out all over the place, and from her body parts he constructs the world that we live in today. So this is a creation myth. A creation myth that recounts the misogynistic killing of the Great Mother, who was identified with chaos and the wild. And ancient civilizations associated good with order. And the king was the incarnation of good, conquering the beasts, killing the lions, cutting down the forests, bringing civilization to the barbarians, domesticating the wild and the unknown. And this process continues even today as we take the pieces of a ruined earth and we try to build our civilizations out of them, building the world out of the destroyed mother, in other words. So the myth of redemptive violence translates in a striking way to a modern science, which says that the tendency of the universe is toward entropy. Everything is created, and once it's created, it starts its long quest on decay, into decay and entropy and non-existence, toward disorder. And only by imposing our design onto this chaotic, disorderly, degenerating universe are we able to maintain a realm that's fit for human habitation, to impose good upon chaos. And so if you accept that nature itself hasn't any inherent intelligence, any inherent tendency toward complexity, toward the emergence of beauty and organization, but instead that it normally degenerates into disorder, then we're inescapably at war with nature all the time, subject at any moment to be extinguished by random natural forces. And our well-being in that view comes through imposing more and more control on this wild, arbitrary, random nature that is outside ourselves. We impose the control internally. And for centuries, the ambition toward control has defined progress. Now, I've always said, like the old Monty Python song from The Life of Brian, life's a piece of shit when you think of it. And it's always look on the bright side of life. I've always said life's kind of shitty. It's what you do with it that makes it work for you. Left to itself, it will decay into entropy, an entropic demise. A good test of this is a simple experiment. Leave your dishes unwashed for a week and see what condition your home will be in. Don't take your garbage out for a week. Don't pick up the messes in your house for a week. See where your household will decay to, the point it will decay to, entropy. you need to enact forces to stop entropy from taking over your existence. So the basic template of war thinking, the first identity, the cause of the problem, the culprit, the perpetrator, finds something to fight. Then control, imprison, exclude, kill, humiliate, or destroy the bad guy, the culprit, the cause, and all is going to be well. And the better able we are to do this, the better human life and our own personal well-being is going to be. Excuse me. Again, no cough button while I'm doing this show. Sorry about that. So Walter Wink, the theologian, gave that example of Popeye and the Sailor. Every episode of the cartoon has the same plot. Brutus kidnaps Olive Oyl. Popeye tries to rescue her and is beaten to a pulp by Brutus. Then just before Brutus can rape Olive Oyl, Popeye eats a can of spinach. You remember that if you're old like me? You remember Popeye? And with a surge of strength from eating his spinach, he turns the tables on Brutus. When I eats me spinach, the evil is finished. I can't remember the song. And Popeye beats Brutus to a pulp instead. That's the entire plot of Popeye. Now, Walter Wink pointed out that nobody ever learns anything from this encounter. The characters don't grow, they don't develop in any way, implying that this is just the way things are. And the lesson is that the way to solve a problem is to overcome the enemy by force. So that is a myth. There is a myth of redemptive violence. And so what about the war on the system, or the symptom? Is there a war on the symptom? The mentality of finding an enemy to overcome with force extends beyond warfare. Take agriculture, for instance. You have a problem, like declining crop yields, or you need to identify that cause. There are weeds in the field, and the solution is kill the weeds. Or maybe you have strep throat. What's the cause? Let's find the pathogen. That's the orientation. Find the pathogen. Streptococcus bacteria. Solution? Kill it with antibiotics. Or how about crime? Obviously, crime is caused by criminals, right? So if we lock up the criminals, then we don't have any more crime, right? Terrorism. Obviously caused by terrorists. So what do? Let's kill all the terrorists. No more terrorism. Problem solved. So here's the question. What if you want to be a better person or more effective in the world? Applying the same formula, you find the inner bad guy. Maybe it's your procrastination, your laziness, your addictions, your selfishness, your ego. As Reuben Fasthorse put in the prayer, he says, and help me fight my greatest enemy, myself. Great. Now you've got something to attack, something to control. Maybe you're overweight, and you think, it's because I'm eating too much. So calories become the bad guy, and the solution is control them. So this war thinking is nearly universal. Attack the thing that is the thing that's creating the problem. So the war on the other thing always mirrors a war on the self. Underneath our judgments lurks this sneaking suspicion that maybe I'm one of the bad guys. Maybe I'm the guy creating the problem. Michael Jackson, his song The Man in the Mirror. Maybe I'm the guy that's the problem. And in fact, this is more or less what science, economics, and many religions have been telling us. For example, an explicit teaching of biology has been that reproductive self-interest is the fundamental motivation of all living beings. Reproductive self-interest, making myself, selfishness, we're told, is programmed into our genes, our well-being. I need to be well. I need to be happy. What's the divorce rate all about? I need to be happy. And that always comes first. It's built in our genes. And that means in order to be anything other than ruthlessly selfish, you have to overcome nature. So that's war mentality. I got to fight what I am genetically made to be. And that is selfish. So an alternative to war emerges when we see all the enemies: weeds, criminals, terrorists, calories, selfishness, laziness, and so forth. All those things. Not as causes of evil, but as symptoms of a deeper condition. Focusing on the symptoms, warring on the symptoms, allows the deeper causes to go unexamined and unchanged. You look at what's going on in our society today. The race wars, the justification, the narrative that's been built. The problem is that the deeper causes are going unexamined and unchanged while we focus on fighting the thing and killing the thing that we think is the cause. And we never ask, why does Brutus want to kidnap olive oil in the first place? If we don't unearth that, we're going to be fighting Brutus over and over and over and over and over again, and eating way too much spinach. And so what if the spinach runs out or stops working? What if the weeds develop herbicide resistance and the bacteria develop antibiotic resistance and Brutus eats spinach too and starts an arms race? So war thinking addresses its failure by going to further extremes. Don't just beat up Brutus, kill him. That's the solution. Find an herbicide so powerful that it kills the weeds once and for all. Find the final solution. The final solution. Hitler said that about the Jews. Defeat evil once and for all in an epic war to end all wars. And try that once. It was called, we tried it, the Great Wars. Now we call it World War I. Then it was World War II. When we see causes as symptoms, we can ask questions like, why are weeds growing in the field? War thinking is not usually helpful with this question. We think, kill the weeds. We don't think, why are the weeds growing? Perhaps there's a lack of biodiversity in the field, or the soil is depleted in some way. And those weeds are coming actually to repair the soil because there's an intelligence in nature. There's nothing to fight. So why is there crime? Is it because those criminals are just bad eggs? Or are they acting from circumstances that we won't ever examine if we're at war with them? What are the economic circumstances? How about legacy racism? What about or systemic racism? What about our trauma, despair, or the loss of our meaning in life? In all cases, war thinking is a simplified, oversimplified, and reducing narrative. It doesn't address the problems. So to wage war, you pretty much have to reduce the enemy. You have to dehumanize the enemy. If you don't like Donald Trump, you have to dehumanize him. It's a prime example. It's a universal tactic in war to make them, the other side, less than fully human. If you want to kill or exploit somebody, dehumanization is a key enabling method. They're all reptilians. As war thinking infiltrates our political culture, we see more and more dehumanization and demonizing of the other side, left versus right, right versus left, red versus blue, Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative. Each side constructs narratives that makes the other side contemptible, evil, inhuman. We have to do that to get the war working. So here's some words that are agents of dehumanization that you see all the time in the political discourse and beyond. How could they? It's totally unjustified. What's wrong with them? A war tactic is to accuse our opponents of some deficiency in their core humanness. They're stupid, they're ignorant, they're immoral, they're entitled, they're greedy. They're murderous. They're stupid. And then this narrative gets weaponized because we can use it to arouse the indignation of our side to fight the war against their side, to stir up war fervor, war fever, so that we can rise up and destroy the bad guys. And you know what, folks? This is just a pure recipe for utter despair, discouragement. So, when you start talking about the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible, speaking about ecological healing, regenerative agriculture, things like that, what would you say to this? The power elite are never going to change. They're benefiting from this. They're happy with this, and they're not going to change. So in order to change them, we're going to have to somehow bring them down. We're going to have to rise up in bloody revolution. That's the only realistic way. You ever hear that kind of thinking out there? I hear it every day. So let's defund the cops. Let's kill the cops. That's one of the narratives that's out there. Let's kill the protesters and Antifa and the narratives that are there. So let's first assume that that's true. If that's true, then our one hope lies in overcoming them by force, because they're never going to change. We have a formula for creating change when there's a bad guy. It's all in the movies, not just Popeye, the old comic strip. It's in Batman. It's in The Lion King fighting against Scar and the hyenas. It's pretty much in every action movie you've ever seen. It's in Star Wars. You kill Darth Vader, you kill the Emperor, you destroy evil. The dark side will regress, and the light, the Jedi, will rise. So in the real world, our one hope is impractical. If it comes to a contest of force, who has more force? Who has more military power? Is it hippies and peaceniks? Or is it the military, pharmaceutical, medical, financial, educational, NGO, prison, industrial complex? They have the guns. They have the money. They have the surveillance state. They have the police. They have control of the media. So if it comes down to a contest of force, the people with the power win. Even if we talk about the force of propaganda, the force of narrative, we try to ignite the rage and the indignation of the oppressed against them. Guess what? They're even more adept at manipulating narratives and making you look stupid and bad because they control the media. They're doing it right now. They're creating narratives that are more ubiquitous and have a farther reach and more PR and advertising behind them and more money behind them than yours does. So domination is probably a recipe for failure unless you become so good at the technologies of war, and I'm talking about all kinds of war, that you do tear them down. Remember, it was Rockefeller, I think it was, who over 100 years ago said, "He who controls the newspapers controls the world." You have to be extremely good at wielding power to defeat the military-industrial complex at its own game. So you defeat the bad guys, and now you're in power. But is the fight over now? No. There's still bad guys out there. And in order to defeat those bad guys, you need to consolidate your power and extend your power, all, of course, to protect the world from evil. It's okay to do that because you're the good guy, right? You're the one who knows it to be true. Let's say the narrative today about the race wars. What if the one side wins? They have to consolidate that power to keep the peace. So identifying as good, the whole war against evil was premised on being the good guys and pushing down the evil guys. So identifying as good, you pursue yet more power. I had one good friend of mine, a black man, and I respect this man a lot. We've gone out to lunch, we worked together, we've done some stuff together. He has views I disagree with. And he was promoting the idea that blacks need to rise up in the United States and create their own nation within the nation. And I asked him, I said, at what point, if that nation ever got created, do you suppose there would need to be laws? There would need to be a police force to sustain your laws. There would need to be more of a power reach, and in essence, all you're doing is recreating the problem that originally existed. So the justification is that the new good guys are going to create a more perfect world. In order to do that, they have to have complete power. Here's the new boss. Just the same as the old boss. We don't get fooled again. As the old Who song said. So what is power? Power is the ability to make others suffer, so you end up becoming evil yourself. And the power to make people suffer, what I mean by that is you make the evildoers suffer, so you can keep raising the good. And so the bar keeps getting raised. And the more likely scenario is that you lose the fight with the powers that be. And that's why so many activists fall into despair eventually. Despair is built into the paradigm of the fight. On one level, it's because we know the powers are too great for us to win. And underneath that, there's a kind of futility. If we do win, it's the same. The science fiction writer Philip K. Dick put it really well in Valis. To fight the empire is to be infected with its derangement. This is the paradox. Whoever defeats a segment of the empire becomes the empire. It proliferates like a virus, imposing its form on its enemies. Thereby, it becomes its enemies. All in the name of doing good. And so if you go to war against war, and if you go to war against the empire, you've actually become the empire. George Orwell illustrated this too when the main character, Winston, gets recruited into the resistance. Actually, he's being entrapped. But he thinks he's being recruited into the resistance, and he's asked basically, how committed is he to overthrowing the party? With questions like, would you be willing to do anything? Would you be willing to commit sabotage? Would you be willing to commit mass murder if it served the overthrow of the evil party? Would you be willing to throw acid in a child's face? And in the book, the character responds yes, and therefore revealing himself to be no different from the party. Do anything to gain power. Do anything to overthrow evil. Would you be willing to throw acid in the face of an evildoer? Then you become the evildoer. I've only got a couple of minutes left, and I'm debating what is the most important thing to hit. I have so much stuff here. Maybe we'll pick this up tomorrow because I think that this is too important to miss out. But I'm looking at my material, and there's a lot here. So let me end with this over the next couple of minutes. There's the threat of the pacifist. Consider the following as a general principle in any fight. And more of our political discourses become a fight, as we all know. The resolution lies in the things that are hidden by the fight. The things that both sides agree on without even knowing it, and the questions that neither side is asking. Look around you, look at what's going on. The real resolution lies hidden by the fight. So, for example, in the fight over immigration, one side says immigration is harming us. They're breaking our laws. We need to regulate them coming in or even keep them out. That's one extreme side. That's not even the side that's being proposed right now on one side, but one side is isolationism. Keep them out. The other side says you're horrible, bigoted, intolerant people. and this nation was built for immigrants. It is inhumane to run detention systems and separate families. We should welcome the unfortunate masses from the world. Now, nobody, at least in the mainstream media, is asking why there are so many immigrants to begin with. What's made life in Guatemala and Honduras and Nicaragua and El Salvador and so forth all so unbearable that people are really willing to risk their lives and their children's lives, willing to leave their homes and families for a totally uncertain future? What would it take for you to leave your country to migrate to another country? That's the question underneath the fight. Now, that's an uncomfortable question. First, because it has to take us outside of the familiar war paradigm of problem solving. For conservatives, you can no longer blame bad immigrants. For the liberals, you can no longer hold to the story of unfortunate victims of someone else that can find salvation in America. Land of the free, because any serious injury to that question reveals that we ourselves, the United States, could have been the cause of much of the misery in Latin America and elsewhere. U.S. support for military coups, juntas, death squads, the war on drugs, neoliberal austerity, free trade policies have made life in many places nearly unlivable. As the saying goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so you look for nails and you start to see things that aren't nails as nails. Because here's your tool. And when you have the tools of war, you look for an enemy. If none is to be found, we are uncomfortable because we don't know what to do with our hammer anymore. And so all the more so when, as with immigration, the perpetrator, the cause of the problem includes oneself. So if you're a pacifist or a peacemaker, you might have to find that you arouse a lot of hostility from both sides of the conflict. People who gain their identity from being on Team Good in the war against Team Evil actually need Team Evil to exist. They need each other's side, and it's like two cards leaning against each other, propping up each other. When evil is taken away, there's a crisis, a kind of political vertigo, and a desperate rush to find a new bad guy. Hence the flailing attempts after the defeat of the Soviet Union and that reconstitute evil in concepts like the axis of evil, Islamic terror, the clash of civilizations, and more by demonizing Iran, Russia, China. Team Good needs Team Evil to validate its identity, and Team Evil doesn't know they're Team Evil. They're Team Good on their side. So the pacifist, by challenging the identity of both sides, arouses more hostility than does the enemy. So pacifists are more despised than the enemy. And you know what? Damn, we are out of time. And there's so much here to cover and think about. And we're going to pick this up again tomorrow and talk about this, creating a peace narrative. Where are you with this? Do you create a peace narrative? Can you be awake? Not woke. Woke is stupid. Can you be awake and rise above and look back from the now? So we got to leave this for today. Folks, thanks for being here. 23-hour break, and we'll see you right back here.